Ever since I first heard about Assassin's Creed Mirage 2 years ago, when it was initially known as codename Rift, I've kept a very close eye on the game. Suffice it to say, as a longtime fan of Assassin's Creed, in particular a lot of the game's earliest entries, I'd been longing for an experience that, well, felt more like Assassin's Creed. And that's not to say I didn't find enjoyment in the more recent RPG games. In fact, I just made a huge video about Origins recently. I love that game and what it did to refresh the series at the time, but in my heart, what I love most about this series is playing as an assassin in a stealth-focused game, engaging in parkour within dense cities, and just immersing myself in a cool historical setting. And while the RPGs have their enjoyable moments for me, they never really felt like Assassin's Creed. The last true AC game to use that original formula was probably AC Syndicate in 2015. Even then though, that game brought in some things I wasn't a huge fan of, like a leveling system. I wasn't too fond of the story, and that combat system just doesn't do it for me. I love Assassin's Creed Unity, it's by no means a perfect game, but it was the last AC game I've played that truly fulfilled the assassin fantasy for me. Whether that was through the story, parkour, stealth, all the tools, black box assassinations, even going back to the original game, that's what Assassin's Creed has always been about. That's the series' identity and what it is at its core. Now obviously not everyone is going to agree with that sentiment. I know a lot of people love the newest RPG games. Fair enough, we all have our different opinions and preferences, and we had 3 massive RPGs all back to back within the span of 3 years. It's only natural that the Assassin's Creed community is going to be divided when you essentially have 2 wildly different genres of games within the same series. Whether Ubisoft intended to or not, they have created a divide in the community. But it doesn't mean you can't still like parts and elements of both. But for me, and those like me that have been craving that Assassin's Creed experience that's been missing for the better part of 8 to 9 years, a game like Assassin's Creed Mirage is what I've been wanting. AC Mirage is not a revolutionary or innovative game. It's not the kind of game you'll see win a Game of the Year award. It's a return to form that gives a lot of what we loved from those old AC games, and a little more and a little less in some areas. Is it a perfect game? Is it a masterpiece? No. But for me and people like me, it's the type of game we wanted, and it's the most fun I've had with a new Assassin's Creed game in years. So all throughout the marketing of this game, we heard a common phrase that almost became like the slogan for Mirage, a return to roots. But what exactly does that mean? Well, regardless of when you first discovered this series or what kind of games you prefer in it, the roots of Assassin's Creed is a stealth-focused open-world game that allows for movement and parkour within a dense location or city, and revolves around assassinating targets as a guy in a hood with a hidden blade. That is the roots of the series. That is the game Patrice Desilets, the creator of AC, and his original team made with AC1, and that is fact. So when the developers of Mirage are saying they want to make a game that returns to the roots of the series, they are developing the game with those main pillars and design philosophies in mind. I think it's evident that stealth, first and foremost, was most prevalent and important for this team to focus on for Mirage. An Assassin's Creed game needs good stealth. That is such a huge chunk of the experience. That involves anything from detection, which they completely rebuilt from the ground up because Valhalla's detection system was a little broken to say the least, and that goes to things like tools, mission design, and skill progression. The entire game has to be built around stealth and with it as the utmost priority. That includes even bringing back fan-favorite missions like black box assassinations, which have always been a key part of Assassin's Creed's mission structure, specifically in Unity and Syndicate, that tried to expand upon them further by giving the player more freedom and creative ways to take down a target. Almost like Hitman or Dishonored in a sense, though still not quite to that scale. But it's not just stealth that made those old AC games what they were. After all, there's still dozens of other stealth-based franchises, a lot of them within Ubisoft alone. What helped make Assassin's Creed stand out, especially at the time of the original game in 2007, was the parkour. The ability to climb and move throughout a city freely. This was probably a product of how popular parkour was in real life at the time and in movies, but it's one of the key things that made Assassin's Creed stand out from other open-world stealth games like it. And parkour has kind of been on a path of regression in Assassin's Creed over the years. The movement has become more streamlined and simplified, especially in the last few games, and parkour isn't as prevalent and encouraged in those large RPGs where there's not a lot of dense cities, and more often than not, you'll need to travel via mount. Now again, we'll go more in depth with parkour later for Mirage, but I know there's some mixed feelings there from old fans. But what Mirage does with its parkour is place you in a dense city with proper parkour pathing. It makes the use of parkour feel prevalent and encouraged once again. It also does a few things to make the movement in general feel better than the last couple of games, but it's still not what a lot of people hoped for. But finally, narrative was a key part in making those old games what they were as well. Playing as an assassin, hunting down Templars as a part of a long-running war, as you usually battle over pieces of Eden. Now again, Mirage's story isn't perfect, even though I do like it overall, but I can at least say certainly that it feels like an Assassin's Creed story, which is something I haven't been able to say for a new AC game in a long time. Assassin's Creed Mirage is a game that is proud of its heritage. It does not shun or ignore what the games used to be, it embraces and celebrates it. It proudly recites the tenets and asks us to sacrifice our ring finger for the Brotherhood. And even though this is still a solid 300 years before Altair and his assassins at Moscow, this feels like a game that pays homage and respect to the game that started it all. But of course, a key pillar of any Assassin's Creed game is its setting and open world. In a series like AC that places such heavy emphasis on the importance of history, the settings are very important. Mirage, of course, takes place in 9th century Baghdad, as Basim in Valhalla stated he lived there for a time, creating a perfect opportunity for Ubisoft Bordeaux to set a game in the Lost City following Basim in his younger years. And it kind of happened to be a perfect coincidence that the game that pays homage to the roots of the series also happens to be set in a similar setting to the original game in the Middle East, and it almost feels like home for this franchise. It brings a certain vibe and feel that goes hand in hand with Assassin's Creed. It also helps bring that Prince of Persia feel as well, which is the series that Assassin's Creed was initially born out of, as AC1 was supposed to be a Prince of Persia sequel. So it's just kind of a perfect coincidence that the game that's going back to the roots also has a setting similar to the original game. Not only that, but I also appreciate having a little bit of a lesser known setting in an AC game. The last 3 games we had Vikings in England, Spartans in ancient Greece, and ancient Egypt. Those are all very well known and historically popular settings, and while I enjoy them, it's nice to get a setting that doesn't just follow the popularity trend or theme like with Vikings or Spartans, and offers a setting that not a lot is known about. Baghdad is sort of a city that's been lost to history, and there's not a ton known about it since it was sacked and mostly destroyed by the Mongols in the 13th century. Now, I wouldn't necessarily consider myself a history buff, but I've always had a fascination with the subject, and immersing myself and learning more about these historical settings is one of my favorite parts about this series. And my knowledge of 9th century Baghdad is next to none, so it was really cool for me to get to learn and pretend like I'm in this city that has been lost to time. But obviously, because there is such little record of it, Ubisoft Bordeaux had quite a lot of work to do in recreating a city that no longer exists. There was a bit of freedom in designing the world, as there's no concrete blueprint of what it fully looked like, and they could look at other similar nearby cities as reference points to what Baghdad may have looked like at the time. And like with every AC game, they did their fair share of research and consulted experts and historians. And the result is nothing short of breathtaking. From a visual standpoint alone, Baghdad is a marvel. The lighting, the fidelity, the vibrant color palette, the world design, and the amount of detail packed into this city is seriously impressive. The city is incredibly dense and lively, while the surrounding wilderness provides a nice contrast with more barren stretches of desert. The surrounding wilderness and sand blowing throughout the city definitely gives me an Origins vibe. I wish this game had sandstorms like Origins as well. I think that would have been really cool. But this was such an incredibly fun and engaging open world for me to explore. A big reason for that is the size of it. Mirage's world is significantly smaller than the last few games. It's more on par with the size of Unity and Syndicate's open world, and because of this reduced size, the developers could focus on creating more dense, content-filled environments for the player to traverse. And even though this world is smaller, it still felt massive to me. The sense of scale and wonder is not lost at all. The first time I was allowed to free roam, and as I approached the towering walls and buildings of Baghdad, I had pure chills. I think a lot of open world games these days are more concerned with making their worlds bigger at the cost of quality, instead of focusing on a more enriched and detailed environment. Rare gems like The Witcher 3, for example, can achieve both, but I think there were quite a lot of areas in Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla that felt bland. And obviously not every area of an open world can be handcrafted when it's as massive as it is. That also goes for NPC density. NPC density is so important for a series like Assassin's Creed. I made a whole video going into the importance of crowds for the series alone and how it works hand in hand with social stealth and the assassin fantasy, but the NPCs are what gives these cities life and bring a sense of immersion. I think AC Unity still has some of the most NPCs I've ever seen on screen in an open world single player game before. That, or maybe Night City from Cyberpunk. So not only does it bring a life and sense of immersion to the city, but in a series like Assassin's Creed where you can do things like crowd blending, which is back in Mirage, or interact with the different civilians, it's very important. Obviously the last 3 games haven't had a bunch of NPCs because they aren't set in one centralized dense city. Everything is a lot more spread out, and there's very few areas where you'll see these large crowds form. When those leaks first started coming out from Mirage, claiming the NPC density was going to be close to what we had in Unity, I got very excited because that's one of the things that made Paris from that game into such a phenomenal open world to explore. Well, that and its parkour design, which is actually something Mirage takes inspiration from. Around when Mirage was first initially announced, there was an interview where one of the developers had said they looked to Paris from Assassin's Creed Unity for inspiration in designing Baghdad for parkour. Now, a lot of people took this out of context and thought it meant that Mirage was going to implement Unity's parkour system, but it was meant just in terms of design. And you can most certainly see Unity's influence in Baghdad's world design. There's a lot of similar pathing and objects similar to Unity, and the flow of the city works in a fairly similar way, which I think was clearly the right call on the part of the developers to look to Unity for inspiration, because Baghdad is so well designed for parkour, just like Paris was. A big reason why Mirage's parkour, while not perfect, feels a lot better than the last few games is because of the world design. It's set up in a way that encourages the player to use parkour, and there's plenty of pathing and routes to ensure you never have to break that flow. though. I've actually seen some really impressive parkour clips for this game already that managed to make this system look really good, and that's a result of the design. They also brought back some key parkour helpers like the corner swings, which had been in the series for a long time, but were missing in Odyssey and Valhalla. On top of this, they added their own new interactions like the pole vault, which I actually would have liked to see more of. I don't feel like I ran into a lot of opportunities to actually use it, but it was fun and useful when I did. And you can also collapse some scaffolding, which can be useful in a chase or in combat. But again, I wish there were a little more of them scattered around the world, as I didn't find many opportunities to use them. But I just love that Baghdad actually made me feel the need to use parkour again. The RPG games have such massive and at times barren worlds that the use of parkour felt more like an afterthought than a first resort for traversal. Whereas in Mirage, it's absolutely mandatory and always the first option when navigating the city. I only ever used my mount out in the wilderness in this game, which is exactly how it should be to me, and reminds me a lot of Rome from Brotherhood, where the mount was really only necessary for the more empty and wide surrounding area outside the city. I'll get more into the parkour mechanics themselves when we get into gameplay, but the world design does a lot here to enhance the experience. And the fantasy of being an assassin, jumping across rooftops, and stalking targets is finally back to a significant degree, and it feels great. But another important part to what makes for a strong open world is the amount of and variety of side content it offers. Mirage's side content takes from both some of the newer games like Valhalla with its treasures, and Tales of Baghdad that feel similar to Valhalla's world events, and from the older games with its simple but fun contracts that has you perform different mission types such as escorts, tailings, assassinations, or heists. The contracts aren't massive in scale or anything too in-depth, but a lot of them are just good fun and offer worthwhile rewards such as important materials, tokens, outfits, or even skill points. The game gives you a good incentive to go out and do these, especially since the skill points are tied into doing missions rather than levels and XP. So the only way you're going to acquire all the skills is if you complete these contracts. The contracts also typically have brief stories or cutscenes involved with them. They're nothing mind-blowing or revolutionary, but they're good for just having a fun, quick activity to do. And since there aren't tons of them, I do wish the game allowed you to replay them, especially since this is a shorter game and there isn't much to do once you finish it. The treasures scattered throughout the world hold either weapons, outfits, or upgrade schematics, giving you proper incentive to seek them out and loot them when possible. They usually offer a brief, challenging puzzle, which some are definitely harder than others, but I for the most part found it to be pretty fun and satisfying to complete. However, it's not the best feeling when you spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to reach the chest to only be rewarded with an upgrade schematic for an outfit or piece of gear you don't use. I wish they tied the upgrade schematics as rewards for something else and kept the chests for purely weapons and outfits. But then I suppose there wouldn't be enough items for all the different chests. This isn't a massive deal, as there were times where I found an upgrade schematic I genuinely needed, but it could be rather disappointing to me at times when I found something I just wouldn't need or use. Now, as for the Tales of Baghdad, there's only a small handful of them throughout the world, but when I did stumble upon one, I found them quite enjoyable. I think they were better written and designed than Valhalla's world events, which could feel more like a waste of time and a poor substitute for a side quest. A lot of the ones in Mirage had some actual interesting stories, where some even offered choices that would change the interaction or ending to that quest. Like for example, in this one, an old man dies, and you have the chance to tell his son the truth of how his father cared more about his work than him, or you lie and take the blame, making the son hate you, but keeping the memory of his father intact. These were short moral dilemmas that, while not super consequential or earth-shattering, like some choices could be in the RPG games, they did provoke a bit of thought and deliberation before making the choice. And quick spoiler warning here, but my favorite one involves giving a kid the courage to perform a leap of faith as you learn he wants to impress and join the Hidden Ones, only to hear this afterwards.
That was amazing! Come on, Hytham, before the Muezzin catches us!
I was shocked when I heard this, even though it seemed rather obvious in retrospect, but this quick little, 1-minute tale managed to flesh out and give some depth to Hytham, a prominent character from Valhalla, as we learn his motivation for wanting to join the Hidden Ones as they avenged his parents, and why he has such a strong bond with Basim. That was a really well executed twist and a highlight of all of the side content for me, even though trying to motivate a kid to jump off of a tall structure into a bale of hay is extremely reckless and irresponsible of Basim.
You see? I am unharmed! Now you go!
I cannot!
Yes, you can! Do not overthink it! You simply need to have faith!
Again, this may not hit the same for players who didn't play Valhalla and don't know who Hytham is, but for those who do, it's a nice bit of continuity. It makes me want to see Basim actually train Hytham to be a hidden one. And outside of these quests, there's some extra world activities you can do for gear and outfits as well, like performing higher level pickpockets to obtain Derwish's artifacts that can be exchanged for a unique outfit once you collect them all, same with the lost books once all have been collected, and the mysterious shards you can loot off several roaming enemies throughout the world, which is how you unlock this game's Izu armor and weapons. It's definitely less of a grind to get than it was in some of the previous games, but still enough to be satisfying once you unlock it. And because the Izu armor looks so badass in this game, the incentive was definitely there. In terms of open world quest design, Mirage isn't unique or innovative, but it's fun. I enjoy doing all these extra tasks and contracts, and because I enjoy the gameplay and traversing the city so much, it was always well worth it to me, not to mention all the rewards and benefits you receive from doing so. But as I mentioned in my initial impressions video of the game, one of the best returning features from the old Assassin's Creed games is the notoriety system. The notoriety really made a huge difference for me in this game, and not only brought back the feeling of classic AC, but also enhanced that assassin fantasy. I love that civilians in this game can actually react to you kill people in front of them, and even point you out or call for help from the guards. It not only feels more immersive, but it also forces you to be more aware of witnesses when killing targets. We've obviously had notoriety systems in the past, although granted it's been a while, but this extra layer with civilians actually being able to bring the attention of the guards is new. And I love that it forced me to be cautious when roaming the crowded streets. You can't just kill a guard in the open and expect to run free without any consequences. That's not what a skilled assassin would do. You either have to avoid them or use the environment to your advantage and find a way to get an inconspicuous kill, whether that's with a smoke bomb, crowd blending, or a bench assassination. And there's sufficient reason and motivation for you to want to avoid gaining notoriety, because then you're going to have rooftop archers looking out for you, and eventually bounty hunters will start tracking you down, which are insanely strong and hard to kill. It makes you want to avoid gaining notoriety and being tracked down by them at all costs. And like the old AC games, you can tear down wanted posters or bribe officials to lose that notoriety. It's just a very satisfying loop, and it's a key part of what made those old games what they were. It's an entire element, layer, and thing to consider that was missing in the last few games. I also just love the idea of the game encouraging you to be stealthy and avoid being seen killing. That's what makes being an assassin so cool to me, being a blade in the crowd and striking from the shadows. It's baked into the very identity of this series. All in all, this world and setting in Baghdad is one of, if not my favorite part of the entire game. For me, it's easily in my top 3 for open worlds in this series, and this kind of setting, world design, and structure, I think is what best suits the Assassin's Creed gameplay loop. Assassin's Creed is a series that has changed quite a bit over the years when it comes to gameplay. A lot of those original games were very stealth focused and had those simple but fun and satisfying counter-kill based combat systems. Now the gameplay of Mirage is obviously what most people were concerned with prior to its release. It was evident that the game would still be within the same Anvil Next 2.0 engine that has been used since Unity, and it was still going to borrow quite a bit from its its predecessor, Valhalla, which is only to be expected when you get a game that was originally supposed to be a DLC and had a little over 2 years of total development. However, despite sharing some similarities and DNA with Valhalla, the two games still play very differently. The fact that they're essentially two different genres, with Valhalla being an RPG and Mirage more action-adventure, is certainly part of the reason for that, but there were also major differences in design philosophy, and Mirage still made quite a few changes from what we had in Valhalla to better suit the type of game it aimed to be, like parkour for example. Now parkour in Mirage is still rather similar to Origins, Odyssey, and Valhalla. It does make some nice smaller changes, but understandably for some people that wasn't enough. Mirage's parkour still doesn't really hold a candle to the AC1 to Revelations era that allowed for lots of freedom and expression within the movement, but it still felt like a fairly big improvement to me over the last few games, and while not exactly what I would have wanted from my ideal AC game, I'm still satisfied with what it offers. What really sets Mirage apart with its parkour from the last few games is Baghdad's level design, which I mentioned earlier. Parkour is heavily encouraged and effectively mandatory in this game, and it feels good to use. The pathing and opportunity is good enough that you can parkour and free run through Baghdad for minutes at a time without touching the ground, a feat that just wasn't possible in the last few games. Now the mechanics themselves are still rather basic, ejects are still contextual and limited to a certain extent. The game doesn't let you freely do them wherever you want like those older games, although they are much easier and more consistent to do in Mirage compared to the RPG games because of the world design. There's more opportunities to actually side and back eject onto things, and if you install Jintohaku's eject height mod on PC, you can actually make side and back ejects far more consistent and viable in the game. There were also some changes made with Basim's general animations. Basim feels faster and lighter than Eivor from Valhalla. Now you could say this was because Eivor was a Viking and wouldn't be experienced in parkour and free running like Basim, who was a street thief and then trained as a hidden one, but Eivor could feel very clumsy and heavy to control. The animations were slow and had lots of weight to them. Basim feels lighter and quicker on his feet. His general running speed is faster than Eivor's, and his parkour animations are significantly quicker too. It doesn't fix the simplicity of the mechanics, but parkour generally feels better as Basim is quicker and easier to control. It's easier to get a consistent and satisfying parkour flow with Basim. Mirage also brought back vaulting to a significant degree that I felt made a big difference. Vaulting was possible in the RPG games, but similar to much else when it comes to parkour in those games, it was very contextual. There were only certain places and objects that you could vault over. Like in Origins, for example, it was mostly only possible in those tombs, and Mirage rectifies this, not only allowing you to vault things we previously could in other AC titles like fences and short walls, but it also has several designated objects scattered across Baghdad's rooftops that you can very easily vault. It generally makes the flow of parkour feel much smoother, and the animations are quick and seamless, preserving Basim's momentum. Parkour still has quite a ways to go before it reaches the level of the AC1 to Revelations era, or even Unity for that matter, but Mirage definitely took several steps in the right direction from the last few games, and parkour felt the most fun, prevalent, and encouraged since Unity nearly 9 years ago. Yes, I even prefer it to Syndicate's parkour, which stripped back a lot of the freedom and advanced movements from Unity, along with London just not being very well designed for it, encouraging players to use the rope launcher more often than not. Another mechanic that was very prevalent in the old AC games that's brought back to a significant degree in Mirage is pickpocketing. Pickpocketing was brought back in Valhalla too, but once again was very limited. You could only pickpocket very specific NPCs when a mission required it. In Mirage, you can pickpocket any NPC that has a pouch, which there's often many of, and it has a very simple timing minigame. And even though it was very simple, I was kind of addicted to pickpocketing. I was constantly doing it, even in the late game when I didn't need items or money. It was just oddly satisfying for me, especially those more challenging pickpockets with Derwis's artifacts. Doing those before you unlock the pickpocket master skill were pretty hard, but it was like a massive dopamine hit for my brain when I pulled it off successfully. That, or you can just kill the person and loot it off their corpse. Now, if you're someone who gets tired of the pickpocketing minigame, you can turn it off in the settings and get guaranteed pickpockets like the older games, which I didn't do personally, but it's nice to have the option for those who just don't care to do it every single time. I also like having the ability to pickpocket be a rather prevalent part of the game, even once Basm becomes a hidden one, because he was a street thief after all, and it's totally fitting for the character to still be stealing and going back to his roots as a thief, even once he is a hidden one. I will say though, the pickpocketing made it very easy to rack up money and tokens, so much so that I just had a ridiculous abundance of both, with more than I could ever actually spend. Before I get into talking about stealth in this game though, because there is a lot to digest there, I want to talk about what's arguably one of the weaker parts of Mirage's gameplay loop, the combat. I feel like combat is an area that Assassin's Creed has always kind of struggled to evolve and make meaningful improvements to. The earliest games, of course, featured the counter-based system, then Unity and Syndicate sort of had their own new takes on it, which didn't pan out too well. Then we had the RPG combat systems, and then there's Mirage, which sort of feels like a scaled back version of the combat from the last couple games. The combat in this game is pretty simple and doesn't offer tons of depth or complexity, but generally I do still like it. That's not to say it doesn't have its downsides though. Firstly, unlike the RPG games, Mirage only has one weapon type. You can only use the sword and dagger in combat, which in a smaller, more stealth-focused game isn't a huge deal, but even those original games did manage to have more weapon variety. In the original AC game, you could use the hidden blade, a sword, and a dagger all separately in combat. In the Ezio games, there were even more options, and you could even disarm enemies and use their own weapons to kill them. So while the sword and dagger are fun to use, the lack of weapon variety can cause the combat to feel stale and rather shallow over longer periods of time. You can equip different types of swords and daggers that provide their own special perks. There's also a fair amount of different combos and tactics you can pull off with the sword and dagger, but nothing too deep or advanced. Parrying is rather simple, only requiring a single input, being left bumper on controller and Q on PC. Again, I prefer how Origins handled parrying. It was a bit more difficult and therefore more rewarding to pull off. There's really only two combat related moves you can unlock in the skill tree, being kickback and the counter roll, which can be very useful. The counter roll is especially good against those enemies you can only attack from behind, but there's very little progression and new moves to unlock for the combat. That said, from a design standpoint, I do like what they tried to accomplish with the combat. This game wants you to use stealth. That's where all the depth and complexity is, and the combat is meant to be more of a last resort than a first. Whereas in the RPG games, they wanted you to choose between two different playstyles, be that stealth or combat. Mirage is a stealth game though, so that's what got the most attention and love from the devs. So I like that the combat is rather difficult, especially on hard difficulty and when facing multiple enemies at once. Basm is very weak in this game. It only takes a few hits to kill him, and at the start you don't really deal lots of damage either. This made stealth a constant priority for me, which is how I prefer it. But in the RPG games, the combat was at times so easy that I really didn't need to use stealth to deal with enemies. You could very easily just walk into an outpost and take everyone down in melee combat if you wanted to. With Mirage, that's a lot more challenging, because Basm feels more like a glass cannon. You can still try and fight multiple enemies at once, but it's going to be a lot more challenging, and you're likely not going to come out of it unscathed. I also really appreciate how the game lets you use the various tools whilst engaged in combat, but we'll get more into that a little later. Mirage, in terms of enemy variety, is rather simple and limited. To be fair though, the RPG games really weren't much better with enemy variety, and I do appreciate that at least some of the enemies in this game force you to change strategies and fight them a little differently. You have your standard swordsmen, who are rather easy to kill, the spear enemies, which fight kind of similarly, but can use their spears hunters to search for you in haystacks, and the bigger brute-like enemies that you can only damage by attacking at the legs or from behind. Some of these enemies have long swords, and then you have others with flamethrowers that can melt away your health rather quickly. Then you have the extremely tough bounty hunters that effectively have all the same moves as Basm. They can parry, dodge, throw projectiles, and even heal. In the early game, these guys are a real pain to try and deal with. It took me a long time before I was actually able to kill one, and eventually in the later game I found a good strategy for fighting them that made it rather easy. But this is also the only enemy type in the game that can't be assassinated, and I personally really like that they're difficult to kill, especially at the beginning. You only get these enemies tracking you down as a punishment for getting max level notoriety, and it gives you a very good incentive to avoid gaining max notoriety at all costs. And when you do hear that horn and see these guys approaching you, more often than not, you'll just want to get out of dodge and lose them. It feels like a big deal when the bounty hunters show up and present a genuine threat. I died to these guys a lot in the early game, and because they were so hard to kill, I did my best to avoid being seen by witnesses anytime I went to assassinate a target. It made me think things through and second guess just randomly killing a guard out in the open because I knew there would be consequences. It almost feels like getting 5 stars in GTA. It's a genuine challenge and something you generally want to avoid because you'll more than likely be hunted down and killed. But what's nice is when you do kill the bounty hunters, you're rewarded accordingly. You lose all your notoriety and essentially get a free refill of your tools by looting them. So there's also a risk-reward element to killing these guys. The enemy variety in Mirage is nothing to write home about, but I do appreciate that different enemies still force you to attack and approach the combat encounter differently. I also really love Mirage's combat animations. I think they're very smooth and fluid. I love that almost any time you get a kill, you'll get some type of finisher. Whether it's the quick but stylish finishing strikes, or the more drawn out and fancy finishers, they look great. As I've said many times before already, I didn't like that Origins and Odyssey would only grant combat finishers on the last enemy of your encounter, while the others you just hit until they die and lamely ragdoll to the ground. It wasn't very satisfying to get kills that way, and I appreciate that almost every time you kill someone in combat in Mirage, you'll get some type of finisher. Sometimes enemies do still simply ragdoll, but that only happens in specific situations, and it's a lot more rare. I also appreciate the variety of these combat finishers. Since you can only use the sword and dagger in this game, it would have been very lame if there was only 1 or 2 finishing animations. I appreciate that there's multiple sets. Some of them are actually animations from AC Unity as well, which I thought was a cool callback. Assassin's Creed has never really been a series about combat, although it is still an important pillar for the games. Mirage's combat system isn't my favorite or least favorite in the series. It probably falls somewhere in the middle for me. It did scale back and simplify in some areas, which I don't believe is inherently a bad thing, as Ubisoft Bordeaux was very clearly attempting to get players to use and interact with stealth as a first priority, encouraging the player to play more like an assassin that strikes from the shadows rather than a Viking or Spartan engaging in open combat. I think without a shadow of a doubt, stealth is one of Mirage's biggest strengths. In the marketing, it was something the developers talked about a lot. As I've said numerous times already, it was their first priority when it came to gameplay, and it shows. Assassin's Creed Mirage is a game that understands stealth, whether that's with mission design, mechanics, or skill progression. First and foremost, the basis of any good stealth game is in its detection system. That is a very crucial and foundational piece to any stealth game, or game that has stealth in general. This was an area Valhalla seriously struggled with on launch. I do believe it was mostly fixed by the end of the game's life cycle, but for those who played within that first year of it being out, the damage was already done. There was a major issue with instant spotting, being detected through walls. Almost every possible issue with a detection system you could imagine was likely an issue in Valhalla. And when we initially heard that Mirage was supposed to be a DLC for Valhalla, a lot of us held our breath, worried that the same issues that plagued Valhalla's detection would be present in Mirage. Mirage. Thankfully, that wasn't the case. As we learned before the game was released, Ubisoft Bordeaux rebuilt the detection from the ground up. The detection in this game is very solid and works consistently. I never had an instance in my playthrough of any broken or unfair detections, and with a consistent detection system, it was easy to experiment and figure out what you could and couldn't get away with within the detection. You could even once again consistently use detection as a way to bait and lure enemies into an ideal position for an assassination. On top of this, they brought back the last known position silhouettes from Unity and Syndicate that let you know where an enemy last saw you, giving you an idea of where they're going to investigate. Having an actual functioning and consistent detection system already makes a big difference. But I think what really makes a massive difference and makes Mirage's stealth such a major step up from the last few games are the tools. The tools are what brings most of the depth and choice in stealth. It's been far too long since I could just simply aim and throw a smoke bomb. The last time that was possible was in Assassin's Creed Syndicate, an 8-year-old game. Sure, Origins had smoke bombs, but they were extremely contextual and could not actually be aimed and thrown. But unlike the old games, the smoke bombs can be modified. There's so many different combinations and modifications you can make that each have their own unique use and purpose. Some are obviously stronger than others, but it was still fun to experiment with all these different options and choices. Throwing knives returned in Mirage as well, which are really fun to use. Not only do they provide a great ranged option, but they're extremely versatile. Whether you want to use them for easy 1-2s, setting off an environmental helper or kill, or even use it as a way to stun and poison enemies. You can modify it to disintegrate bodies or get a charged throw to consistently kill at longer distances. There's a lot of good options there. The blow dart has also returned, last seen in AC Black Flag, but the sleeping darts in Origins provided a similar function. I have no idea why there was no alternative to this in Valhalla, but the difference with Mirage, of course, being you can upgrade and modify the blow dart to deal different effects and serve different purposes. I personally went with the area of effect modification that knocked out multiple enemies when grouped together. This was a very easy way to deal with clumped up enemies or get a double assassination. But of course you can modify it to do plenty of other things as well, like turn them into berserk or poison darts, make enemies sleep indefinitely, or make it so they can't be woken up by their comrades. The noisemakers serve as the game's best option for luring enemies, which a lure is practically essential in every stealth game, and while the last few games have still had the whistle, that brings enemies directly to you. So it's nice to have a gadget that you can throw and lure enemies into whatever position you want. And like with everything else, the modifications make the noisemakers incredibly versatile and useful in a variety of situations. They actually quickly became one of my favorite tools to use because you can carry up to 10 of them and use them as more than just a simple lure. The modification I applied would scare enemies away when I threw the noisemaker in their close proximity, almost working like those fear bombs from Syndicate's Jack the Ripper DLC. The trap is a new tool unique to Mirage, though we have had similarly performing tools in Assassin's Creed in the past. Now this was the last tool I unlocked in my playthrough, but it can actually still prove to be extremely useful, effectively rendering enemies immobile for long stretches of time, allowing for an easy kill or distraction, whether that's in combat or stealth. It's proximity based, or you can modify it to activate at the noise of your whistle. All of the tools in this game are incredibly fun and versatile to use. We've had a similar selection of tools in the older AC games, but never quite like this, with all the potential for the different combos of modifications. This game gives you plenty of options to use in stealth, and the freedom and choice to select the modifications and combos that best suit your needs and playstyle. This is the best innovation Mirage makes on the traditional Assassin's Creed formula, and something I hope can be expanded on even further with more options in a potential sequel. Another one of the big new additions to Mirage is Basim's special ability called Assassin's Focus. There was a pretty big debate amongst the AC community before the game came out, and even I was skeptical of this ability when I first saw it in the gameplay trailer. I loved the idea of having a special chain kill ability that you could charge up and use at will, and most of the community did too. We just weren't big fans of the look of the ability with Basim teleporting around. Now Ubisoft Bordeaux actually actually explained this by saying that Basm is moving so fast and efficiently that is causing the Animus to glitch as it can't keep up with his movements. I actually really appreciated this explanation because it gave me a way to justify it in my head. Knowing there's an actual reason that fits within the AC lore, it makes sense to me for how Basm could possibly have this ability. And knowing that Bordeaux actually cared enough to provide an explanation was nice, because they could have easily just said nothing and gave no justification for it. I mean, how do you explain half the stuff the demigods can do in AC Odyssey? And for all those who were still dissatisfied with the Animus glitch explanation, might I remind you that this was a thing in the old Assassin's Creed games as well. It's the exact same situation as Arno's disguise ability in Unity or Evie's invisibility in Syndicate. Those are Animus glitches, and so that kind of thing is not new in Mirage. I do also appreciate Ubisoft Bordeaux listening to the community and adding more glitch screen and sound effects to Assassin's Focus to make it more apparent that the Animus is glitching. It kind of brings in the sci-fi element that has always been in Assassin's Creed as well, which I like. And I know a lot of people wanted it to look more like Arkham Knight's multi-fear takedowns. I was one of them at first, but I don't really see how that would be possible, as Assassin's Focus allows you to reach much further distances and can be activated while falling and jumping, along with reaching different elevation points. They would have had to completely rework the ability, so that would not have been possible. And because you can use Assassin's Focus in all those situations, it gives the ability lots of versatility and potential to use it in creative and smart ways. The base use of the ability is obviously to chain kills, but as many players have quickly discovered, that's not really the best way to use it. The best way to use it is for movement, using it to reach areas or locations at an efficiency and speed you normally couldn't, also using it in dire situations, like when you've made a mistake and are about to get spotted, or you're going to fall to your death. You can use it in combination with your other tools like the throwing knives to get some creative multi-kills. This ability brings a lot of added creativity and depth to stealth. Some players may consider it a bit too strong and kind of a crutch, which I can understand the argument for, as it gets very easy to recharge once you get all the skills, and you can activate it even if you don't have the ability fully charged. But for me, the potential and depth this ability adds outweighs that. I know some people chose to just not use the ability, and fair enough, you do you, but I believe Assassin's Focus adds to the assassin and stealth experience far more than it subtracts. The level design and ability to use your environment adds another dimension to stealth as well. Being able to drop heavy objects down onto enemies, use spice bags as a makeshift smoke bomb, or using the countless benches scattered across the world for a stealthy assassination were very useful. It gives you more options and choices in stealth and further fleshes out those encounters. Having the traditional eagle vision back was really nice too. It did return in Valhalla, but I like how it's toggleable in Mirage and provides you with consistent, reliable information while in stealth. The drone bird from the last few games with Enkidu is still there, but it feels more like a gimmick than a first priority for intel gathering. And personally, I know I prefer having the traditional eagle vision as opposed to relying on the eagle to scan every enemy in the area. With that said, Enkidu is still needed for finding objectives and can be useful for finding chests or determining enemy routes with the right skills unlocked. I really like the inclusion of an enemy counter to Enkidu with the marksmen who try to shoot Enkidu out of the sky. It forces you to prioritize taking down the marksmen first so you can scout the area. It was a smart addition to the enemy types, and I wish there were more of them because they do provide a little bit more of a challenge. Similar to the combat animations, I really like Mirage's assassination animations as well. What I want from assassinations is for them to be quick and varied. They need to be quick so I can kill enemies in fast succession and not be stuck in the animation for too long, and varied so I don't get tired of seeing the same animation play out over several hours. I largely prefer these animations over the last 3 games, and for the most part they are quicker. The only one I really don't like is the one where Basm flips the enemy over his shoulder. It just takes too long and can kind of kill the flow and pace of the stealth sometimes. But some of the animators at Ubisoft Bordeaux have to be big fans of Assassin's Creed Unity, because some of these animations are from that game as well, similar to the combat finisher I mentioned earlier. Which is great, because Unity's still by far has the best assassination animations in the entire series, all in terms of quickness, flashiness, and variety, so why shouldn't they take inspiration from those animations? Another key element that adds to that experience and has properly returned in Mirage is social stealth. Now, social stealth was never unique to Assassin's Creed. It's been in other stealth series like Hitman, for example, but it became rather well known for it as it became a key pillar of the stealth experience in some of those older games. It was missing entirely in Origins and Odyssey, when Valhalla promised to have it back. And while it technically kept that promise, it only fulfilled it at the bare minimum. There were a few areas and locations within the world where you could interact with different things stealthily. For example, sitting on a bench or pretending to be working on something. And very occasionally, you may find a crowd to blend in with. It was back, but still a far cry from what social stealth was in those original games. That, and there were very few moments where social stealth actually felt viable in Valhalla. Mirage brings social stealth back to what it was in those original games. You can crowd blend with any civilian NPC, assuming they aren't children. As long as you have 3 other people, you can freely crowd blend and hide in plain sight. One of the core tenets of the Brotherhood, I might add. Some of the missions encourage you to crowd blend, yet the game will never flat out hold your hand and tell you to do it. You have to look for the opportunity for yourself, and if you choose to seek out those opportunities, it can be a very helpful tool in stealth. Mirage also brings back the factions you could hire from AC2 to Rogue. It does work slightly differently, as instead of using money to hire them, you now use unique tokens you can acquire through doing contracts or just pickpocketing civilians in the open world. This kind of ties back into what I was talking about earlier, where I felt it was a little too easy to get an abundance of these tokens. It's not really a huge deal, but it ensured that I could always hire out factions to aid me and never really had to worry about running out. To be fair, it did work very similarly in those old games too, where in the late game I had so much coin that it was mere drops in the bucket to hire factions. Now, you can't really use the factions quite as freely as you could in the older games. For example, they're only positioned in set areas where they can distract nearby guards. In the old games, you could hire mercenaries, prostitutes, or even thieves, and actually have them follow you and sick them on any enemy you choose. So they are a bit more limited here and are most useful for infiltrating restricted areas unseen. But having them back does make a big difference and allows the player more freedom and choice in some of the larger stealth missions. At times, they can be useful for sneakily looting a chest or distracting guards to move out of the way as well, but you'll most commonly use them in the larger black box missions. The return of the black box missions is one of the most important returning pillars of those older AC games. Black box assassinations give the player a sandbox with multiple different routes and opportunities to assassinate a target, aiming to give the player freedom and agency with how they choose to assassinate said target. These missions were popularized by Assassin's Creed Unity, which had several large assassinations that allowed for multiple distraction and infiltration opportunities, and typically a special assassination you could trigger by following a specific path. These were also used in Syndicate, but then largely abandoned until Valhalla's Siege of Paris DLC. But within that DLC, the black box missions were very linear and didn't even have as close to as many opportunities or paths to follow. So when we first heard black box assassinations would return in Mirage, we were hoping they were more similar to Unity and Syndicate and not the Siege of Paris from Valhalla. Now, thankfully, they are closer to what it was in Unity and Syndicate, although still not quite the same. You get ample amounts of distraction and infiltration opportunities within these missions, whether it's by hiring a faction, bribing someone with a token, or finding a hidden entry point. You still get a fair amount of freedom when it comes to these missions, even if it's still not the ideal level of freedom that I'd like for this series. I think what Assassin's Creed should ultimately aim to achieve with the black box assassinations is something on the level of the Hitman games. Those missions in Hitman have insane scope and freedom to be completed in dozens of ways that not only give the player a sense of agency and choice over how they kill their target, but also provide great replay value, as you can replay those missions and complete them in extremely different ways. While Mirage does allow for multiple routes routes and ways to reach your target, the end result will still always be the same. For example, with the First Order member assassination, you need to use one of the opportunities to lure the target out into the open for an assassination, and you have to use one of these opportunities. The game won't just let you ignore those and go assassinate him inside the building on your own. So while there is freedom and choices to be made here, you can't really change the end result or assassinate the target in a different way. Same thing with the Grand Auction assassination. One way or another, you have to acquire this hairpin, whether you bid on it in the auction or choose to steal it. You need the hairpin to assassinate the target. There's no other way to reach Ning and assassinate her. So these missions still aren't exactly like they were in Unity and Syndicate, but it's still much more freeing and open-ended than the Siege of Paris from Valhalla. Regardless, I very much enjoyed having the black box mission structure back for those main assassinations and a few other standout missions as well. These missions are the most memorable for me from the entire game, and I think if Mirage ever does get some form of sequel, it would be great if these missions could be expanded upon in scope and freedom even more so, bringing it closer to the level of a game series that has effectively perfected the mission structure like Hitman. The black box missions aren't the only mission type to return from the old games though. Tailing and eavesdropping missions have returned as well, which have always had mixed reception from fans. I made a video a few months ago where I really went in depth talking about the tailing missions in Assassin's Creed and why I felt they can be good if done properly. I believe tailing and eavesdropping is a fundamental part to being an assassin. It's a part of that fantasy. Stalking someone from the rooftops or from the mass of a crowd. Overhearing important information by blending in nearby. It's part of the series' identity and that assassin fantasy. These missions were major parts of the original game, however I do feel some games in the series overused these missions, mainly AC3 and Black Flag. It was used so much to the point where they got so boring and frustrating that some people flat out wanted them gone altogether, and they've been mostly absent from the series ever since AC Syndicate. But when a tailing or eavesdropping mission can be used sparingly and effectively, they're often pretty fun and engaging, well, for me at least, which is pretty much what Mirage does, with a few exceptions. The tailing and eavesdropping missions are still present enough so that they feel like they're a key part of the game, but they're still used rather sparingly and spaced out through the main missions, so I didn't roll my eyes or sigh in frustration whenever a new one came up, like I did several times in AC3 and Black Flag. I had no frustrations with the eavesdropping missions. They're very easy and straightforward, and it's a very simple but useful tool that allows Basm to obtain important information regarding a subject or target. With the tailing missions, most of them were fine, although I remember one in particular that had me really frustrated because it was very long and I accidentally messed up towards the end of it. And unlike the old games, you don't just desynchronize and restart it immediately. Since Mirage has this open mission structure, if you fail a tailing mission, you have to go find a bench, pass the time until it's the next day, and try again. There's a lot of hoops to go through and time wasted just to restart the tailing mission, which I found infuriating. But aside from that one time, I didn't have too much issue with the tailing. Some may consider it outdated mission design and something that was better left in the past, but I think tailing is still a key part to being an assassin, so I am glad they decided to bring these missions back in a smaller capacity. The overall mission structure to Mirage is also very different from anything we've had in Assassin's Creed before, as it's a lot more open and doesn't follow a linear path. The quests are also presented through an investigation screen where you have this big web of intersecting targets, intel, and missions, designed to almost make you feel like a detective. It's a bigger, more complex version of the Order of Ancient and Cult of Cosmos tabs from Odyssey and Valhalla. Now, I know there's some mixed feelings on how Mirage went about structuring its main missions. Some may have preferred a completely linear, straight path like the old AC games, but I, for one, actually don't mind how Mirage went for something more open-ended. First of all, I really like the design of this whole tab. Again, it makes you kind of feel like a detective, searching for clues and investigating different paths. My complaint is that it can just feel a little overwhelming sometimes sometimes. There were times in the game where I had so many different things to do that I didn't even know where to start, and it can leave the story and missions feeling disjointed since you're not doing them in any predetermined set order. So there's definitely pros and cons to it. Again, I like the freedom it offers, and I like that it feels like you're investigating and discovering intel. It's a similar feeling I had while playing as Altair in AC1, doing all of those investigations. I do understand the complaints though of it causing everything to feel a bit disjointed, as you can take down a lot of these targets in whatever order you choose. But I do also like that this screen replaces the quest log from the RPG games. It feels far more fitting for a traditional style AC game. Another massive reworking from the last few games has to do with the skill tree and progression. Assassin's Creed Mirage has no leveling system, which has always been how I preferred it. I never thought levels had much place in an action-adventure series like Assassin's Creed. Obviously, for the RPG games, they make sense because you need the levels, since it's such a core part of the foundation of the games in that genre. But with a game like Mirage, it's completely unnecessary. So rather than having skill points distributed through gaining XP and levels, you get them as rewards for completing specific missions, be that main missions or even some contracts. The progression is a lot more linear and story-based. As Basm gains experience and becomes a better hidden one, you gain more skill points and earn new special skills. The skill tree itself is quite small, especially when compared to the massive web of convoluted skills from Valhalla, but it serves its purpose well enough. Rather than getting meaningless stat boosts like plus 4% damage when attacking with this specific type of weapon, all the skills actually have noticeable effects on the gameplay, be it a new combat move, more tool capacity, increasing the amount of targets you can kill with Assassin's Focus, etc. Some skills are certainly more useful than others, but having some genuinely useful skills incentivized me to prioritize them and make some hard choices. Now, you can actually unlock all the skills eventually, but at the start you may have to make a few tough choices for which skills you want to get first. The skill tree is nothing innovative. It borrows a few skills from Valhalla, and I do wish there were more unique skills suited to Mirage. Although some of those borrowed skills have been majorly improved upon, like the chain assassination, which now feels way quicker and consistent than it did in Origins and Valhalla. But as I said previously, I think the skill tree still serves its purpose well enough, and I liked having the progression be more straightforward, defined, and linear. These skills still made some noticeable differences in the gameplay, and I could feel Basm getting stronger as I progressed through the game. I also loved the inclusion of the assassin ranks in the inventory screen. It is kind of a gimmick and doesn't have any real effect on gameplay, but it was an easy, cool way to track Basm's progress as he rises the ranks of the hidden ones. You also get special talismans, and of course, eventually the Master Assassin outfit for rising the ranks, which happens every time you assassinate a main target. Again, the ranks don't have any real gameplay effect, but I really liked the inclusion of it regardless. It's something we've never had in a previous AC game, and it's fun to go on this journey with Basm as he ranks up as an assassin. Speaking of the Master Assassin outfit though, which just so happens to be my personal favorite outfit in the game, and no, it's not just because it happens to be the name of my channel as well, I really like the customization options in this game. Unlike Valhalla and Odyssey, customization is more cosmetic based as opposed to trying to increase a stat or gear score number. The outfits do still have special perks attached with them that can give you an advantage in gameplay, but customization is still mostly cosmetic, similar to Origins and all the games before it. And rather than being able to equip each individual piece of gear, you can only change the outfit or costume itself. The customization options in this game are somewhat limited, as there's only 16 base outfits and costumes, plus the pre-order and deluxe edition bonuses and all the store outfits, but of the smaller pool of outfit choices, there's a lot of good options. I said this in my initial impressions video of Mirage, but it just feels good to look like an assassin again. Just a simple assassin in robes and a hood. The community had to fight for like over 2 years just to get a hood toggle option in Valhalla, and it's been a while since we just had a very solid selection of assassin-like attire for our main character. Obviously, there's some other unique looking outfits that don't look like an assassin as well, but looking the part of an assassin seems to be such an overlooked part of the assassin fantasy itself. Some people people may think wearing an off-white outfit with a hood may not be a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but I think it's a genuinely important part of being an assassin. I want to look like one. It just turns this little switch on in my brain that makes me feel like so much more of a badass while playing the game. It also really helps when Basim's default outfit looks as clean as it does. Mirage did bring back the outfit dyes that were prevalent in a lot of the older games too. Some of the outfit dyes look great and make the outfits look better than they already do, but I will admit I was still a bit disappointed at the lack of options. I wanted more dyes and a bigger range of colors we could equip onto these outfits. Some only have 2 or 3 dyes, and there's a fair amount that don't have any. Ideally, it'd be nice if we could just have a full color wheel and customize the colors of the outfits ourselves, which a lot of modders have already done, but I at least would have liked to see more dye options. Maybe that's something that could be achieved through updates, though I wouldn't hold my breath. That said, a good majority of the dyes that are present in the game, I really like the look of, especially the black dyes. Those have been my favorite to use. I like that many of the outfits come as rewards for completing different objectives as well, like the treasure hunter outfit for finding all of Derwis's artifacts, the scholar one for finding all the lost books, and the Izu outfit for collecting the mysterious shards, which happens to be one of my favorite Izu outfits in these games in recent memory. There's also a fair amount of customization options for the swords and daggers. Similar to the outfits, they have special perks that give the weapons a distinct advantage of some kind, and you can even transmog the weapons if you want to use the visual aesthetic of another weapon while keeping the special perk of the other. A small but important thing to me I feel Mirage has done better than the last few games is giving the game a sense of groundedness and realism. Now obviously it's not fully realistic, no Assassin's Creed game ever has been, but after fighting mythological beings, magic animals, and all manner of strange enemies in Odyssey, Valhalla, and even at times in Origins, it's really nice to just have a more historically grounded experience in Mirage. Even with things like Assassin's Focus, which is an Animus glitch, and some glowing skins, which I chose not to use, it still feels more grounded than the last few games, and a bit more in line with the sense of realism the earliest entries provided. Still not quite to the same level, but closer. It's nice to just be a normal flesh and blood assassin fighting flesh and blood humans and the occasional wild animal. Another super small but awesome addition Mirage has is allowing the near complete freedom with binding the controls on controllers. There's a lot of freedom with the control binding, and you can even set it to be like the old AC games control schemes, with holding the right trigger to sprint or changing melee attacks to the buttons as opposed to the bumpers, or just changing it to whatever you're most comfortable with. This is a great accessibility addition for controller players, and something that needs to be included in every Assassin's Creed game from now on. Assassin's Creed Mirage may not provide a completely innovative gameplay experience, but it successfully brings back the feeling of old Assassin's Creed, while even managing to improve and add things that not even the original games offered. It may not be the gameplay experience for everyone, but it manages to deliver for the most part on the kind of experience old Assassin's Creed fans have been craving for and missing for the better part of 8 years. And as a fast-paced, stealth-focused adventure, Assassin's Creed Mirage understands what makes a genuinely fun, meaningful, and engaging assassin experience. And now it is finally time to discuss the narrative. There will be spoilers ahead, so for those who are watching this without having finished Mirage, you've been warned. But in the build-up leading to Mirage, the story was probably what we knew least about. For obvious reasons, I think most people were concerned with the gameplay, amongst other things, but the narrative is obviously a very important key component to any single-player narrative-driven experience. Those fantastic stories are a huge part part of what made those original AC games so popular. But what we did know prior to the game's release was that Mirage's story was going to be rather unique in comparison to the rest of the series, because the game's protagonist, Basim, was also in AC Valhalla, marking the first time in the series where an antagonist from one AC game would become the protagonist in another AC title. Now, I absolutely loved the idea of this. Shortly after Valhalla released, I literally made a video talking about this very idea, wanting Basim to get his own game before Mirage was even announced or rumored to be happening. Basim was easily my favorite character in Valhalla, and I found it strange that the game had us play as Eivor the Viking instead of Basim, who was an actual assassin, and in my opinion anyway, the more interesting and complex character. I've also been someone who's wanted a little more continuity and continuations of stories and characters in these games for quite some time. Ezio remains the only protagonist to this day to get a sequel, and he got 2 of them. Meanwhile, I felt there were so many other protagonists that deserved sequels and should have had their stories expanded upon even further. Connor, Edward, Arno, Bayek, yet those never happened. There's been a lot of potential in this series to continue the stories of characters from other games, and that potential just went to waste. Basim is the first character since Ezio to appear in more than one Assassin's Creed game. It has been 12 years since that has happened in this series, and I think that really works in the story's favor. It makes Mirage a much more rewarding experience overall to those who played Valhalla and really wanted to know more about the extremely ominous and ambiguous Basim. There was just so much potential in that character, and with him being the fan favorite of the game, it just made sense. Well, evidently Ubisoft Bordeaux recognized that potential as well, as they were originally going to make a DLC exploring Basim's origins, but realized this was such a rich, strong idea and foundation for a story that it should be its own game. This game starts in 861 AD, about 12 years before the start of Valhalla, as it follows Basim in his younger years as he rises from street thief to master assassin. Basim is a unique protagonist compared to the rest in the series for so many reasons. Not only is he one of the few to appear in more than one game, but he's far from the traditional hero we are accustomed to playing as in this series. In Valhalla, Basim sort of ends up being the secret final antagonist slash final boss as he betrays and attempts to kill Eivor. His motivations are kept very ambiguous throughout nearly all of Valhalla, and he's a character with a lot of darkness and weight to him. That scene with him and Eivor at the campfire remains my favorite of that entire game to this day. On top of this, we also learned that Basim is the reincarnation of Loki, similar to how Eivor was the reincarnate of Odin. There are so many things here that differentiate Basim from your traditional Assassin's Creed protagonist, and I love that. However, Basim at the start of Mirage is a very different man from how we knew him in Valhalla. He feels like an entirely different person, and throughout Mirage you see the events that unfold that morph him into the version of Basim we knew in Valhalla. Basim's character arc can also be seen more so as one of regression rather than progression, as his character goes from hero to more so of an anti-hero whose morality falls in the gray area. But one of the larger reasons Basim may feel so different, especially at the beginning, is he's actually voiced by a different actor. Basim was voiced by Carlo Rota in Valhalla, while in Mirage he's voiced by Lee Majdoub, who is like the evil sidekick in the Sonic movies, and I actually remember him from his role in Arrow. But the reason Carlo Rota didn't reprise his role for Mirage, despite his excellent performance in Valhalla, is because his voice had a certain grovel and deepness to it that wouldn't fit for an early 20-year-old Basim, and the narrative director said she wanted to find a voice for Basim that could showcase the light and optimism within the character. As in Valhalla, the character is far more cynical, so in Mirage they wanted to display a different side to him, and Lee Majdoub was able to bring that light, more optimistic side to the younger Basim, and I am a huge fan of his performance in this game. I think he nailed it. Despite them being two different people, Lee's voice still fits the same range and timbre of Carlo Rota's in Valhalla. It was believable to me that this was a younger version of that that voice. And what impressed me the most was the progression of Basim's voice throughout the game. At the start, it's higher pitched and sounds a lot lighter and enthusiastic.
But I am honored you think I could reach such heights. I may just aim for them.
But as Basim matures and ages, and after he's gone through the vigorous training and tasks as a hidden one, you hear his voice change over the course of the story. And by the very end, he sounds very similar to his Valhalla voice.
For me, home is family. But I have no family.
Our way. You sit bleeding to death and still cling to this foolish dogma.
This was an intentional choice made by Lee Majdub, who wanted to demonstrate Basim's journey and development through the sound and changing of his voice. Overall, I was very impressed by his performance, and he most certainly did the character justice, and did a fantastic job of making the voice sound in line with Rhoda's performance in Valhalla. Now, as for Basim's journey itself, it may not have been perfect or the best story told in Assassin's Creed, but I found it to be very engaging and well executed, especially at the end. But Mirage starts with Basim as a thief on the streets of Ambar with his best friend Nihal. Basim and Nihal's relationship is one of the main focuses of the story and the character of Basim, and I enjoyed how it was portrayed. Their bond and relationship felt very real to me. The banter, the arguments, all the ups and downs, but you could tell that this is the kind of relationship where whatever happens, they're always going to be there and care for each other. With both of them being street orphans, it's easy to see how they became so close and why they care so much about each other. Although there is of course a sad truth to why that is through a revelation at the end, but we'll get into that later. Mirage has a rather lengthy prologue / opening. It's around an hour and a half to 2 hours before you actually become a full-fledged hidden one, and I for one really like that. I know some people are extremely impatient and probably just wanted to get their robes and hidden blade right away, but I think this lengthier introduction makes it all the more satisfying and rewarding once you finally do become a hidden one. I loved getting to see Basim train as a novice before becoming an official hidden one. These games so often skip through or gloss over the training process to becoming an assassin, and it's something I've always wanted to see in more detail. Getting to see Basim learn and become a more skilled assassin makes him becoming a hidden one feel earned. I really enjoyed the training montages and the time lapses, and I think the training section is just about the perfect length. It's not too long to the point where it becomes boring, and it's not too short where it feels like you don't even get to see Basim learn these fundamental skills. This entire section functions great for tutorials and teaching players how to play the game, as Basim is also learning. Not to mention, you're training right below Alamut Castle, a location that holds incredible historical significance for Assassin's Creed, as this is where the real-life assassins the series was inspired by lived out of. It's been mentioned numerous times throughout the series, and this is the first time we've actually gotten to see it with our own eyes. Granted, it is under construction and not fully finished. I am a little disappointed we didn't get to go into the castle itself. I had hoped we would get to go in it, as the cinematic trailer got my hopes up, but regardless, it's still really cool to finally see this very important landmark in the Creed's history. Plus, it's been a while since we've been in an actual functioning brotherhood with fellow assassins and followed a character that was just simply rising the ranks. We haven't played as a hidden one since Bayek co-founded them in Origins, and we haven't played as an actual assassin since Syndicate. But even in Syndicate, you were mostly operating on your own with the Fry twins and Henry. Here, you actually have an army of fellow hidden ones and a proper structure and pecking order to the Brotherhood with novices, masters, and a mentor. It gave me a feeling I haven't really had since Assassin's Creed 1 at Masyaf Castle. Seeing the initiation was so awesome, and actually getting to partake in the ring finger sacrifice, that's still one of my favorite moments of the entire game, and I was geeking out like a child throughout the whole thing. Just hearing the tenets and some of the most iconic lines of the series, it's been far too long. I remember remember thinking during this scene, this is Assassin's Creed. This is what it's all about right here. And I found myself saying that several times throughout the entirety of the game. Another thing I really enjoy about Mirage's story is the tone. Assassin's Creed has felt tonally inconsistent to me as of late. This was a series that started as a dark, serious sci-fi mystery. However, some of the more recent games have opted to go for lighter tones, like Quebec's games, with Syndicate and Odyssey. I have nothing against lighter tones, but I always felt Assassin's Creed did better when it was darker and took itself more seriously. So the tones of Syndicate and Odyssey, and even at times in Valhalla where the game would have random, bizarre comedic moments, just felt off to me. I understand if others prefer the lighter tones, but I just feel in Assassin's Creed specifically, I have a much easier time engaging with the stories that aren't afraid to get dark and take itself seriously. And Mirage does just that. I mean, when I saw the kid with the slingshot strung up at the start of the game, I knew this game wasn't going to hold back. Almost the entire game, you're just a no-nonsense hidden one hunting down Order of Ancient members. The situation is serious and dire, and you can feel the sense of duty all the characters have. Sure, there's still moments of levity and some comic relief characters like Kong, of course, but those moments never really feel overbearing or out of place to me like they could in some of the most recent titles. None of these assassins are playing games. They're here to accomplish their objective, and it never strays too far from that path. But another core part to this game's story and Basim's coming-of-age adventure is his dynamic with his master, Roshan. Roshan is voiced by the incredibly talented Shohreh Aghdashloo, who has one of the coolest voices in existence and is absolutely perfect for this role. Roshan is a very wise and stoic master to Basim. I felt she had a lot of profound and insightful lines of dialogue and a great understanding of what the Hidden Ones stand for. I found her character extremely interesting. However, because Mirage is a shorter game, I did feel there wasn't a lot of time to explore her character on a deeper level. There were a few scenes and moments where we got to learn more about her, like how her first kill was her own father and how she considers herself a daughter to no one. She also tries to pass a lot of knowledge on to Basim about letting go of the past and focusing on the present, which was a lesson she had to learn herself. But there weren't many other opportunities to dive a little bit deeper and flesh out Roshan more as a character. I know she had a book going deeper into her backstory come out along with the game titled Daughter to No One, which I'm sure fleshes out the character more, but it's probably unrealistic to expect the casual gamer to read this book. But even with Roshan's mostly limited screen time, I still really liked her character, and her dynamic with Basim was entertaining to watch unfold, especially when it all comes crumbling to the ground at the end. In fact, the juxtaposition between Basim and Roshan is probably one of the most interesting elements of the story. Basim is a person who's been struggling to discover his self-identity. He wants answers, and he wants to know more about himself, and all the answers to Basim's questions live in the past, while Roshan believes the past should be buried. Part of becoming a Hidden One is abandoning your old life and identity and being reborn. So what Basim wants and what he seeks goes against both the philosophy of Roshan and the Brotherhood, which is what leads to the conflict between the two at the end. Basim's journey is one of self-discovery and self-identity, and as he hunts down the Order of Ancients one by one, seeds of doubt are planted in his head by Nihal and the rebel leader Ali, as he begins to lose faith in the Hidden Ones and what he's doing, putting the needs of the Brotherhood and what his superiors demand of him above his own. After all, one of the biggest ironies of the Creed that several other protagonists have faced is that they believe in the quality of free will and freedom for all, yet everything they do is in service to their masters and the Creed. Basim from the beginning wanted to join the Hidden Ones because he had such a strong sense of justice, wanting to fight the corruption that has plagued his home like his father did, who was a public servant and someone he clearly idolized. He has selfless goals, and the Hidden Ones were the best means to fight that injustice. But there was always something lurking in the dark recesses of Basim's mind: the Jinni. The mystery of the Jinni is a big focal point of the story, and its constant haunting of Basim starts to bring him to his breaking point, hence why he's so desperate to get answers. Basim's conflict is internal, not external, despite him hunting down the Order of Ancients. And the ones who, ironically enough, offer to give him those answers are the Order of Ancients. This is now the third game in the series to have the Order of Ancients be at the center of the conflict and serve as some of the main antagonists of the story. As we know, of course, the Order of Ancients would create the foundation for what would eventually be the Templars. And similar to AC Origins, your main goal is to hunt down these Order members and bring a stop to whatever they're up to with the Izu artifacts and their corruption of Baghdad. Also, similar to Origins, these Order members don't make for the most compelling villains. They obviously don't have a lot of screen time, and there's no real opportunity to get a good grasp of their motives or anything. The leader, Kabiha, is an underwhelming antagonist. You only speak with her once before the reveal at the Grand Auction. It was a twist that somewhat caught me off guard, that she was the leader, but looking back, it made sense. But her presence in the story is so limited, and she dies almost immediately after giving Bazum the necessary information he needed. Again, it reminds me a lot of Origins and the twist that Flavius was the leader of the Order. The shock from the twist comes more so from the fact that these characters had such little screen time prior to their reveals, rather than it feeling like a heartbreaking betrayal. But with the way the story is structured, with the Order of Ancients and their leaders, it's set up to be more like a mystery to unravel, by discovering each of their identities, rather than building them up to be these compelling, fleshed out antagonists. Assassin's Creed has never really been known for its villains. It's always been more known for the protagonists, which is like the exact opposite of Far Cry. But like ever since Al-Mualim and the Borgias, and maybe Haytham Kenway if you want to include him in that discussion, there hasn't been a well-written and memorable villain in a long time. The antagonists are probably the weakest link of Mirage's story, but the conflict of the story is more focused around Bazum's internal struggle, rather than solely on fighting the Order. If anything, Kabiha was mainly just there to tell Bazum what was beneath Alamut, and push along the conflict between Bazum and Roshan, which leads to a very wild and climactic ending. I liked Mirage's story well enough to this point, but the ending is really what brought it up a level in my eyes. I love this ending. It's bold, it's shocking, it's unpredictable, and it's a very different ending than anything I've seen in Assassin's Creed before. First of all, the final confrontation with Roshan. Similar to the original Assassin's Creed game, the final boss is the protagonist fighting against their own master/mentor. Roshan has known from the beginning that there was something special about Bazum, as he was able to awaken the Izu artifact, and she knew that something was waiting for him in the vault beneath Alamut. She actively decided to hide this truth from him because she believes that to be a hidden one, you must abandon your past identity, let it go, and embrace the Brotherhood. But the problem was, Bazum couldn't let go of his past. It was literally haunting him in the form of the Jinni, and the answers and keys to finally discovering who he was were in that vault. So Bazum decided to go against Roshan and abandon all he had to chase his past and find answers. This was a final boss with emotions and stakes, and I really liked how it was executed all around. It's the classic, only the student has hope of defeating the master, and that's exactly what Bazum did. Even using the same move he tried at the beginning of the game during their training to take her down. This fight is then followed by a series of really well executed plot twists that I honestly didn't see coming. I think the best kind of plot twists are the ones where once you've seen it, you can then go back and connect all the dots. See all the examples of foreshadowing, and seeing certain moments that felt weird before suddenly all make perfect sense with this future knowledge. The twist with Nihal only being in Bazum's mind and representing Loki's personality was exactly this. It was a twist I genuinely didn't see coming, although obviously I knew something was strange with Nihal, the way she would just randomly disappear and reappear. But going back through all the scenes with her and Bazum, there's a lot of subtle and not so subtle hints that she was never actually a real person. For starters, she never talks to or interacts with any other character besides Bazum. She randomly pops up and appears at locations Bazum is at without any possible way of knowing he was there. Roshan doesn't notice Nihal behind her, spying on her and Basim's conversation. Even at the beginning in those scenes with Derwis, he never once reacts to anything Nihal says or acknowledges her presence at all. He's only talking directly to Basim in those scenes. All these little things that didn't quite add up or make a ton of sense before, now suddenly make perfect sense. Not to mention, Nihal's name literally means newly planted seed, as she is the newly planted seed of Loki. Nihal is a representation of Loki's personality, who is more selfish and self-serving than Basim, which is why Nihal is constantly trying to get Basim to look out for himself. And then we learn that the Jinni is all the pain and suffering that Loki endured as a result of being a prisoner of Odin. Those memories festered in the darkness and haunted Basim for nearly his entire life, and once he finally understands what they are, he can let them go. Basim then of course decides to adopt the personality of Loki, which is not too hard to understand considering he felt betrayed and alone, and this personality happens to have the face of his longtime friend and the only person who's ever truly been at his side. I felt these were really well executed plot twists, and I was worried the ending might be predictable since we already knew from Valhalla that Basim was the reincarnation of Loki. But even with that knowledge, this ending still caught me off guard and had me shook. The writers did a great job of using what the audience already knew and using that knowledge to create a twist in an unexpected way. And the game ends with this new Basim emerging from the vault, swearing to find and hunt down those who tortured Loki and who caused him so much anguish with those memories, represented by the Jinni. This is no longer the same selfless, heroic Basim from before. He's now learned to serve himself above all, and even Enkidu wants nothing to do with him now. I really liked this moment too. We knew something had to happen to Enkidu as he wasn't in Valhalla, and I thought this was a really cool explanation for why that is, and it gives some meaning and backstory to why Basim has this scar across his face in Valhalla. Basim responds to this with a slight smile. I interpreted this as kind of an evil smirk, like he was thinking, whatever, fine, leave me. But I've seen others think this smile was actually more so one of sadness, as he's now lost everyone and everything he once cared about. He's now truly alone. I like that interpretation as well. Not really sure which one it is or if it's either, but regardless, this was a great ending scene, and I thought this ending in general was very well executed on multiple fronts. It's not the kind of ending we're accustomed to in this series. Basim caved and embraced the Loki persona, which leads him down the path to hunting down the other Norse god reincarnates like Eivor. This is a pretty bleak ending, and I really liked that. It was different, it was dark, it was unexpected. Basim was already my favorite character in AC Valhalla, and after playing Mirage, he's become one of my favorite characters in the last 10 years, and he's certainly up there with some of my favorite protagonists of the series. I wouldn't go as far to say my favorite, but I love how his character was written across both of these games, and I think getting to see that transpire over 2 games really helps. It's nice to finally get some extra time with a character in this series in more than one game. I wouldn't even be opposed to Basim getting a sequel. There's still a large gap of time between Mirage and Valhalla that could be explored, with Basim and Hytham and the Brotherhood in Constantinople where they met Sigurd. If this is it for Basim's character, I'd be kind of sad, but at least I'd still be satisfied with his journey in this game. We should, at the very least, see him in the modern day storyline, as he's now an integral part of that, which, with all this characterization and extra depth added to him, that should only enrich the modern day storyline going forward. Speaking of the modern day story though, obviously there's basically none in Mirage. The extent of the modern day is the brief opening narrated by William Miles at the beginning. All we know is Basim gave his blood sample to William and the assassins in Valhalla's last chapter, and they wanted to sift through his memories to confirm his loyalty to the Brotherhood and his true motivations. It's never clear who exactly is in the Animus witnessing Basim's memories, whether it's some random person or William himself, and it's hard to even remember at times someone is in the Animus, since there's no reference to it at all outside of the opening. I thought there may be something at the end that would hint or set up the modern day storyline that's coming up, but there was nothing. The modern day storylines of Assassin's Creed have always been controversial amongst the community. Some people think the series should just abandon the modern day and focus purely on the past and history. Others think it's a fundamental and crucial part of this series. Regardless though, the modern day in Mirage is the least prevalent it's ever been in any Assassin's Creed game. Even games that didn't have as prevalent of a modern day as the others, like Unity and Syndicate, still had a lot more modern day sections than Mirage. This might be a trend that continues as well, as most of the modern day storylines may be told through the Infinity Hub that's launching with Codename Red more than likely next year. Now personally, I've always liked the modern day element to Assassin's Creed, but it's kind of a slippery slope, because if it's a bad modern day, then it pulls the player out of the fun part of the game and can kill the pacing. And if that's the case, then I'd rather just have no modern day at all. The modern day from AC1 through AC3 was very interesting and engaging. It was a very core part of the experience of those games. And while I've always preferred the past storylines, I'd still like for modern day to be a prevalent part of the games. It's a core part of what makes Assassin's Creed so unique. I didn't necessarily find myself missing the modern day in Mirage, but where the modern day story ended in Valhalla was getting really good and kind of left on a cliffhanger. So I really want to see what's next for that story, especially with Basim now in the modern day and the potential of Desmond's return. But I'm assuming that story will be continued in either Codename Red or Hexy, or just through the Infinity Hub. Even though it would have made sense to continue in Mirage, since Basim is now a crucial part of that story. But this game was originally going to be a DLC, and I'm sure there were already plans in motion for what's next in that story in other projects, so it was probably unrealistic to expect anything of substance regarding the modern day in Mirage. I understand why some people may be upset by the lack of modern day, but I was well aware beforehand that it wasn't going to be a big part of the experience, and overall, I was okay with it. Would I have liked to see more modern day stuff? Sure, yeah. Like I said, I think it might have been cool to at least tease what's next a little bit towards the end, but I'm not too upset or bothered by it, because I'm pretty confident that this modern day story will pick up again with Codename Red, and I enjoyed Basim's journey in Mirage, and with the game already being shorter in length than the most recent titles, throwing some modern day stuff in there would probably mess with the pacing and structure. All in all though, while I don't think Mirage's narrative is perfect, I still really enjoyed it. I think Basim makes for such a compelling protagonist, and I loved the twists and turns on his adventure. The ending was brilliant. I thought that really elevated the whole story, and while the antagonists were pretty forgettable, it was good to have what feels like a true Assassin's Creed story again. Playing as a hidden one, rising the ranks of the Brotherhood, hunting down targets, meeting in bureaus, the memory corridors, the traditions, the rituals. It gave me a feeling and vibe I hadn't felt in a long time, and reminded me of my younger years being in awe of these assassins with their hoods and hidden blades. Assassin's Creed Mirage is no Mirage when it comes to beauty. This game is a looker. It may not be the best looking game of 2023, and not a huge improvement over Valhalla, but with the incredible lighting and atmosphere of Baghdad, it's a sight to behold all the same. I think the vibrance of the city and level of detail makes it a better looking game than Valhalla, even if there's not a huge difference when it comes to graphical fidelity. And despite the density of the NPCs and buildings, the game still runs very well. Doesn't matter if it's in the crowded section of the city or in the wilderness, the game runs very well, and I had next to no issues with performance. A lot of people did have issues with the game's chromatic aberration effect that can make distant objects appear blurry, but the game just had an update not too long ago, giving players the option to toggle that off. I understand if for some people the game didn't take quite as big of a leap graphically from Valhalla as they may have liked. For a current gen game, but with it being built with the same tech as Valhalla and still being available on the last generation of consoles, it was never going to be a massive leap. Codename Red will probably have some impressive improvements, I would think, as it's been developed with only the newest hardware in mind. But still, Mirage is a gorgeous game, and the artistic direction definitely did this region of the world justice. Now, where Mirage is less visually impressive are in the cutscenes. Unfortunately, with Mirage being built with the same technology as Valhalla, it has the same issues in cutscenes I had with that game. The character models look a bit odd, although I did think some certain character models looked significantly better than others, but the real issue is more so in the body and facial animation. The characters and their movements can look really robotic, and it can kind of take you out of the story for a moment. I talked about this at length in my Origins versus Mirage video, but the cutscenes in Assassin's Creed have 100% been on a path of regression since Origins. Compare the cutscenes of Origins to Odyssey, Valhalla, and Mirage, and it's a night and day difference. And really a big reason for this downgrade is that these games have stopped using motion capture in cutscenes as much. Motion capture captures the actor's real movements and expressions in a scene, so that when it's put in the game, all the movements look real. They look human. AC Origins used a lot of motion capture, hence why I think its cutscenes looked so much better, while in Mirage, it's clear they only used motion capture in a small handful of scenes, and you can tell when it is and isn't being used. Like for example, it's obvious they did motion capture for a lot of the pre-rendered cutscenes, like Roshan saving Bazum, Bazum's training montage when they head on their journey to Baghdad. These cutscenes look really good, and it's too bad the rest of the game can't live up to that quality. Now some of you may be wondering why they wouldn't use motion capture on every cutscene if it looks so much better. Well, because it's more expensive and time consuming. I'm not sure if the lack of motion capture in Mirage has to do with the budget, or maybe because Ubisoft Bordeaux is a smaller studio and only had 2 years to develop the game, so they couldn't afford to pour all these resources and manpower into the cutscenes, but I do still find it disappointing. The reason Odyssey and Valhalla have a lack of motion capture is because those games are massive and have so many different scenes, there's just no way they could possibly do motion capture for everything. That's the case for a lot of large RPGs like them. But with Mirage, I was hoping that wouldn't be the case, since it's a much shorter and smaller game. This series has used motion capture going back to Assassin's Creed 2, and I honestly think the cutscenes in the Ezio trilogy look better presentation-wise than Mirage. Obviously not in terms of graphic fidelity, but those games used motion capture for nearly all the main story cutscenes. Unity and Syndicate's cutscenes look significantly better than Mirage 2. If you showed these side by side to someone who doesn't know Assassin's Creed, they'd probably think Unity was the new game and Mirage was the 9-year-old one. Origins is still probably the pinnacle of presentational quality in this series, and I'm really hoping this path of regression doesn't continue. Then again, Codename Red is going to be another massive RPG, so I wouldn't expect tons of motion capture for that game either. But an area of the game that absolutely lives up to the quality standard of Assassin's Creed is the soundtrack. Pretty much every AC game soundtrack hits, and this game is no exception. The OST perfectly fits the vibe of the setting and the vibrant city of Baghdad. This version of Ezio's family is one of my favorites in the series, and the soundtrack does nothing but elevate the entire experience. Soundtracks can be such an overlooked but crucial part to any video game in general, and Mirage does not disappoint in the slightest in that regard. Mirage from a presentation standpoint is still good. The environments look incredible, the vibrance of Baghdad, the day-night cycle, but the cutscene presentation was rather disappointing to me personally, which is a shame because I think it does ultimately hold back the story and the performances of the actors. I already really like the story, but if it had the same cutscene quality as Origins, or even Unity and Syndicate for that matter, it would be several times better than it already is. Assassin's Creed Mirage is a game I've had a close eye on ever since that first rumor popped up almost 2 years ago, saying there was going to be a Return to Roots AC game following Basm with the codename Rift. I was cautiously optimistic, but still had my fair share of skepticism. I've been burned many times before after all. Every time I saw the game though, I was liking what I saw, and I had a feeling this could finally be the game to deliver what I and so many fans of Assassin's Creed have been missing for the better part of a decade. And it did. Mirage is a game that celebrates the roots of the series and has a good understanding of not only what makes Assassin's Creed what it is, but what also makes a fun, engaging, and satisfying stealth game. This was Ubisoft Bordeaux's first full game they were in charge of developing, and yet they managed to understand this series and what a lot of the fans wanted better than the studios that have been there since the inception of the series. On top of this, they were constricted on time and budget, having a little over 2 years to develop the game and limited to a lot of the technology of Valhalla. And they still managed to pull off what I think is an incredibly fun game. Is it a perfect game? No. As I said, you aren't going to see it beat out the other titans for Game of the Year, but as an Assassin's Creed game, it delivered on nearly everything I'd want from one and became a top 5 game in the series for me, and it reminded me why I love this series in the first place. Which is why I believe Assassin's Creed Mirage is the best Assassin's Creed game in years.